They did stock up on goods, particularly during the first quarter, bringing those in before any tariffs were in effect. But as they run down that inventory, the next batch that comes in could well be subject to tariffs. And if so, that cost is going to have to be eaten along the way. The retailers themselves have taken a bit of a hit, but ultimately, this is going to make its way to the consumer in some way, shape, or form. We haven't really seen much of that yet. The bulk of it is expected to still be coming.
Yeah, we know that Trump has reached out before and basically told companies, Walmart, the auto industry, to eat any kind of costs that come with tariffs. But really, how much longer can retailers hold off on something like that? Now, arguably, we're already seeing it in a big way, especially in the auto industry.
Yeah, I mean, the auto industry in particular really feeling it. A lot of manufacturers that import components from overseas, they've been feeling it for some time. The profit margins were pretty stout to begin with. And so there was a little bit of room there. We've seen businesses, particularly large companies that have the scale, that are able to absorb those. They've been eating some of that and been reluctant to pass that on to the consumer. But what about mid and small sized businesses? They don't have that scale. They don't have the ability to eat that. They operate on much thinner margins. And so if they're in a position where they can't pass along those higher costs to consumers, maybe because spending is a bit slack, they don't have much pricing power, that has a much more dire impact on their bottom lines.
Yeah, and think about how big consumer prices were during the election. And Trump has simply been crowing about the strength of the U.S. economy right up until he fired the head of the labor statistics. And that move raised a lot of red flags. Now, are we about to see a second wave of inflation, this time tariff-driven?
We are going to see the tariff effects showing up in inflation. Now, the unanswered question is it going to be just a one-time bump in prices, or is this something that's going to be more prolonged? Does this have a self-reinforcing cycle to it? And that's the question everybody's trying to get their arms around, most notably the Federal Reserve. That's why they've been reluctant to cut interest rates, because they don't really have a good feel for what's going to happen with inflation and just how sustained that might be, but it's coming.
Okay, explain it to me, because how could it be one time if Trump is going to keep these tariffs in place? It's going to be every time something comes into the country.
Now, the price just resets to the higher level that's reflective of that tariff. So, something that was imported for $100, if it's got a 15% tariff on it, it now costs $115 to bring it into the country. The price will be adjusted up to reflect that cost.
Okay, so
it just happens one time. The concern is, might that lead to a self-reinforcing cycle of ever higher costs? Right. I just don't think a lot of businesses have that type of pricing power.
Okay, so which sectors are going to feel the tariff pinch first? And are price hikes being driven more by tariffs or by corporate margin protection? Because you talked about that. I read an article earlier that talked about widespread concern that people are having about the price of groceries, for example.
Yeah, I mean, agriculture items, that's one that there's no stocking up on inventory there on perishable goods, right? So that's one that you feel in very, short order, that gets passed along to the consumer. We talked about autos and manufacturers, that a lot of them that either have assembly in other countries or import components from overseas, things like steel and aluminum that have been subject to these higher tariffs for months, they've been feeling that already. So, I think in some cases you've seen, like in the automotive industry, it's really hit second quarter earnings, whereas in a lot of other industries, we really haven't seen it pop up yet. But the consumer is bound to see this showing up to some extent, because profit margins can only absorb so much. Some of that is going to make its way to the end user.
Greg, we've seen when margins get pinched, layoffs can often follow that. Could this wave of tariffs lead to job losses if demand does drop?
Demand is really the key. And I think the other aspect of this, it's not just the tariffs as much as it's the uncertainty about tariffs. Businesses that don't have clarity on how much things are going to cost and the impact on their business, they don't go out and hire a bunch of people. They don't expand production. They don't make investments. They don't make long-term plans. They instead sit back and wait for the dust to settle. Well, that in and of itself is a headwind to the economy. So even aside from the tariffs themselves, just the uncertainty about how much, how often, and when, that type of uncertainty could be a headwind to the economy.
Okay, so what about Trump's argument for he wants to bolster U.S. manufacturing? Is this working? Is it making U.S. manufacturing stronger?
Well, those supply chains were built out over the course of decades. So this isn't a situation where you just wave a magic wand and all of a sudden a lot of manufacturing that had been done overseas for the last 20 or 30 years suddenly comes back to U.S. shores. This takes a long period of time. Also, I mentioned the lack of clarity or certainty. Well, those are the type of changes businesses don't make when they don't have clarity or certainty. If they've spent 20 or 30 years building out these supply chains overseas, they're unlikely to change that on a whim if the tariffs themselves might change on a whim.
Greg, quickly, what's the biggest thing that you're concerned about moving forward?
Well, the labor market really has raised some concerns. We saw that Friday with the jobs report. So that's really been the key. Spending has been strong because people are working. When money's coming in, that money gets spent. But if you start to see layoffs mount, that's going to hit that demand that we were talking about.
Okay. Greg McBride, can't thank you enough. Great insight. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean.